Our first speaker for the day is Chanel Smith. She's an adult acute care nurse practitioner who completed her master's at the University of Toronto and her undergrad at the University of Western Ontario. She presently works at South Health Campus for both the inpatient cardiology service and in the heart function clinic. Her career has been mainly focused in cardiovascular care, and she has a special interest in heart failure. She is currently a member of the Canadian Heart Failure Society Nursing and Allied Health Council, which aim to improve educational opportunity and resources for heart failure management. On this note, welcome, Chanel, and please go ahead and share your screen. So Chanel, you're muted, so we can't hear you.
Can you hear me okay there now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I apologize. I've never had to use my phone and the computer before for Zoom. So welcome everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today. This is an area of passion for me, and it's always nice to spend time with people who are really enthused about learning more about heart failure. So thank you so much for joining us. So today we're going to discuss a few things. How do our hearts work? How does sodium contribute to symptoms? How to eat low salt? I'm going to look at a Mediterranean diet, and that's also touched upon by Dr. Miller later on. We're going to discuss fluid recommendations. I have some general tips, and then finally we'll end with some community resources that are available to you. So here is a look at our heart. The right side of the heart is made up of two chambers. There's the right atrium and then the right ventricle. The role of the right side of the heart is that it receives blood from the body that has been used by the organs. And the right ventricle will then pump that deoxygenated blood over into your lungs. The left side of our heart, it will receive blood from your lungs that has higher oxygen content. And you can see that similar to the right side, there is a left atrium and a left ventricle. The left ventricle is the pumping station of your heart. With every squeeze of your left ventricle, blood is pumped out to your brain, other organs, arms, and legs. The left ventricle has to work against your systemic blood pressure to push blood forward. So when your blood pressure is high, the left ventricle will actually be working harder. When we eat foods that are high in sodium or drink a lot of fluid, the volume of blood in our bodies increases, which adds additional workload and stress to our hearts. Heart failure really is an umbrella term. For some people, it can mean a weak left or right ventricle. Sometimes weakness can exist on both sides of the heart. In other people, heart failure is the result of a stiff heart. You can talk to your healthcare team about what heart failure means for you if you're curious. So the question is, does diet matter? And the difference for symptom control in heart failure can actually be significant. Excessive salt and sodium can lead to debilitating symptoms and even hospitalization, and it's one of the most common reasons I see people in the emergency department. Let's look at it another way. I often say this to the patients I meet in our heart function clinic, that if you had injured your back or broken your back, you might be able to walk around and feel okay as long as you weren't carrying any extra weight. It's similar in this way. So if you're eating a lot of sodium, it would be the equivalent of maybe putting 20 or 50 pounds on your back, and all of a sudden it's hard to walk, it's harder to breathe, and it also can impact both your symptoms as well as your recovery. So that is a useful analogy sometimes to use when you're thinking of this. So sodium and your symptoms. Sodium can result in fatigue, shortness of breath, mental fog, poor sleep quality. So sodium causes you to retain fluid, which will cause your heart to have a harder time pumping, and then you can have something where you wake up in the middle of the night gasping for air, or you require more pillows underneath your head to feel comfortable. We know that your diet can have an impact on depression or lower mood, that being in decompensated heart failure can result in poor stamina, and that you can also see that you can have swelling in your feet, ankles, legs, or abdominal bloating. And we can also see that sometimes when people have tremendous abdominal bloating, that can also impact your appetite. So when you control your symptoms well, what we can see is sometimes a decrease in your level of fatigue, and that you're able to walk around better and just feel like you have a higher quality of life. So really important to think of this, that heart failure control can be achieved by good medical therapy and by close self-monitoring. The two go hand in hand. Taking your medications as prescribed is incredibly important, but it's not the entire picture in achieving good health. A healthy diet, exercise, and monitoring your weight and symptoms daily complete the picture. Daily weights are really important to help evaluate how you're responding to your medical therapy and your diet. Weight increases of 3 pounds in 2 days or 4 pounds in 1 week should be reported to your healthcare team. We're also interested in unintentional weight loss over the course of months, and that's important to monitor. And so I often tell my patients that instead of writing their weights on just a scrap piece of paper, that they should record that on a calendar. And that way we can look at what your long-term weight is doing, and then guide you from there. So diet and heart failure, I really equate this to a double-edged sword. On one hand, we know that very few conditions can be directly impacted by dietary choices, and heart failure absolutely is. And so if you were to compare this to breast cancer, there wouldn't be a lot from a dietary standpoint that would change your symptoms from day to day. However, in heart failure there is, which is an opportunity in my mind. So we know that symptoms can actually be improved by dietary changes and adherence. And the possible side effects from eating a healthier diet include possible weight loss and improved mood and better energy. And for some people who have, low body weight, it's not weight loss they're hoping to achieve, eating a better diet can actually help you gain appropriate muscle mass or body tissue. On the other hand, a lifestyle change is required. And for some people, this is not a quick fix. Your relationship with food possibly needs to change. And what I mean by this is that for some people, food is something that they use to soothe themselves when they're feeling stressed, or we even have food as entertainment. So you go to the show, you like to have your popcorn. For many people, food is deeply personal, and there's also cultural implications for this. And so changes can be difficult from that standpoint. And most people do find salt tasty. And so you can see that it adds a layer of responsibility to your care, but the social implications of food are quite significant. So in terms of what we recommend for sodium, 2,000 milligrams a day is what the recommendation is. And if you're trying to look at how you should manage your sodium content throughout the day, we actually recommend 600 milligrams per meal per day. Visually, 1 teaspoon of salt is going to be 2,300 milligrams, and so it's less than a teaspoon of salt. That is the recommendation. So how do you do the low sodium diet? It's really important to label read. So you look at your serving size, and in here we have 10 crackers, and then you look at your sodium ingredient, your sodium milligram amount. And so here you can see that if you eat these 10 crackers, you're going to have a 210 milligram amount deducted from that 2,000 milligrams that we suggest per day. Generally speaking, what they consider low sodium foods are 2,000 milligrams or less per serving, or 8% of your daily value or less. I kind of tend to steer away from looking at the daily value amount and instead get you to focus on the serving size and the sodium amount. And that way you can calculate that throughout the day. if you're finding that it's difficult for you to keep track of everything, there are different fitness apps on your phone. For example, one would be MyFitnessPal, where you can actually use your phone to scan the barcode. It will upload the information, and then you enter in your serving amount, and it keeps track of your dietary intake throughout the day, and it will comment on sodium. So if this isn't an issue for you, maybe check that out. So I hear this quite commonly, but I don't use sodium, and people are really happy to report to me that they're not using their salt shaker. And this doesn't mean that there isn't sodium in your food. So you can see here this sandwich that has both higher sodium choices and then on the right lower sodium choices. And you can appreciate that no sodium was actually added to this sandwich. However, just the contents in and of themselves are salty. So you can see that there is a significant amount of sodium in the bread, in the mustard, and then also in the deli meat. And the deli meat does not really significantly decrease even with choosing a lower sodium variety. And so a good rule of thumb sometimes is to just entirely avoid deli meats. You can also see here that cheese can be a culprit for having a higher sodium content. And so it's really important to label read when you're using cheese. And a good rule of thumb for that is to avoid cheese spreads or processed cheese. So I really think this was a great example of how, even though you may not be adding salt to your food or using a salt shaker within your household, that there can still be considerable amount of salt in your food. And if you look at the total, even on the sodium reduced side, 852 milligrams, that's still almost half of your daily recommended sodium amount per day. So here's another look at high sodium foods and things to generally avoid. And you can see that cured meats become quite are very much something to avoid. So ham, sausage, and bacon. If you would compare the same amount of ham to something like a pork tenderloin, I think ham in a 3-ounce quantity is about 1,015 milligrams of salt compared to a pork tenderloin, which would be about 58 milligrams of sodium for the same serving size. And so how we prepare our meats and foods is a really important thing to consider. I also want to draw attention to your salt substitutes with potassium. With heart failure, you're often on medications that can cause you to have a tendency to retain potassium. And so using a salt substitute with potassium is something that you have to be careful of. So talk to your healthcare team about whether or not a salt substitute with potassium would be appropriate for you. And generally speaking, try to season your foods with herbs or lemon, pepper, garlic instead. So here is, this slide specifically does not pertain to sodium itself, but I found it on the National Institute on Aging, and I thought that it was a really nice thing to bring up as well, which is the concept of food as fuel versus a setback. And so shifting our nutritional choices from things that are high calorie or high sugar contents, refined grains, to healthier options. And so I've kind of outlined some of this. And then we do get a lot of sugar and unhealthy ingredients in our prepared beverages. And so here are some ideas of how to potentially approach your fluid intake in a healthier way, where you can add fresh fruit or vegetables like cucumbers to water, which are still delicious and thirst quenching, but also are not necessarily a setback in terms of your food plan. In terms of grocery shopping tips, this was taken from the American Heart Association, and it looks that, when we look at a food that has less than 140 milligrams of sodium per serving, that's actually considered a low sodium food. Less than 35 milligrams would be considered a very low sodium food, and anything less than 5 milligrams of sodium is actually considered sodium free. So that may help you to have a guideline of how to approach things in a grocery store. I do want to say, though, that buyer beware, foods labeled reduced sodium are not necessarily low in sodium. Manufacturing requirements are that a product is 25% less than original product to meet this designation. And you can certainly appreciate that in some canned soups that still have a significant amount of salt. We'll just touch here now on the Mediterranean diet. So here is it's actually taken from the Alberta Health Services website. I'll go in to this later about how you can print this off and keep it as a resource for yourself. So it talks about foods and the amount that you should intake per day, and then also things that you should have every single week. So it's really important to look at what the recommendation is, whether that be daily or weekly. So you can see here that there's quite a significant emphasis on vegetables, fruit, and whole grains. And then there is no limitations to using the herb, spices, garlic, and onion to flavor your food. They also are including milk and alternatives, and there's a daily intake recommendation of olive oil, so either choosing virgin or extra virgin olive oil, and then including nut seeds. I would not recommend olives because of the sodium content in them, and avocado. The one caveat to this that's important to note is some of these vegetables, fruits, avocado can actually have higher potassium amounts. So again, talking to your healthcare team about whether or not high potassium has traditionally been an issue for you, and then they can provide you with some recommendations on vegetables and fruit that have lower potassium values. So just continuing on with what is recommended here for the Mediterranean diet. So they're saying 3 servings or more of beans, peas, and lentils. And that's actually, I believe, I can't see because of the video here. Oh, there we go. I think that was every week. It's cut off there. Fish and seafood, 3 or more servings every week. So they're recommending fish that are high in omega-3 fats, which include salmon, sardines, herring, mackerel, or trout. An important note about salmon is that it's preferable to have wild-caught salmon rather than farmed salmon. The difference in the omega-3 content can actually be quite significant. And some farmed salmon, you're really not going to get the benefit from that. And then choosing lean poultry over red meat, such as beef, pork, or lamb, or goat. So more information on the Mediterranean diet. There was actually a SMILES trial, which stands for Supporting the Modification of Lifestyle in Lowered Emotional States, which occurred in New Zealand and Australia. This was a randomized control trial. The participants were 18 years or older and met diagnostic criteria for a major depressive episode. They also had confirmed poor dietary quality prior to enrolling, and participants were then put into a control group, which was a befriending group, versus the diet group. So the befriending group met with researchers to discuss topics unrelated to their mental health, whereas the diet group met for 7 counseling sessions related to their diet. And the Mediterranean diet was recommended with these sessions were actually led by an accredited practicing dietitian. And they rescreened at 3 months for baseline data and a telephone follow-up at 6 months after the intervention. And interestingly, at the end of the trial, 1/3 of participants in the dietary support group met criteria for remission of major depression, compared to just 8% in the social support group. And the results were closely related to the extent of dietary change. This is a really important trial in my mind because about 1/3 of the patients we see who have heart failure actually can suffer from depression. And so this is a really nice study that looked at how we can actually support your mental health at the same time as we are treating your heart failure. So here's the food pyramid. This is how the patients in the study were actually counseled. And again, it's important to look over here. There's a daily amount at on the left-hand side here, and then a weekly amount that provides you with some guidance in terms of what you should be aiming to achieve in your diet per day. And you can see that fish was at least 2 servings per week, poultry 2 to 3 servings per week, up to 6 eggs. So you just want to make sure that you're not mistaking these for daily recommendations, and that instead you're realizing that these are weekly recommendations, and then kind of planning your food ahead accordingly. So with heart failure, there's also a fluid restriction that we recommend, which tends to be 1.5 to 2.2 liters daily. Ask your healthcare team what you should be striving for. And the rule of thumb is this, is that if something is liquid at a room temperature, then that counts as part of your fluid. And so it's important to take into consideration ice cubes or popsicles, even ice cream. There's also a lot of fluid content in some of the the vegetables and fruit that we eat. And so I thought this was a really interesting picture that shows the water content of cucumber, strawberries, grapefruit. And so you don't necessarily need to limit these items, but it is something to be aware of. A, you could quench your thirst, potentially by incorporating some of these foods into your diet, but also to be aware that if you're going to sit down and eat half a watermelon as a snack, that the water content of that is quite considerable, and that you should probably be pulling back on the rest of the fluid that you drink throughout the day. So it's important to talk about how to prepare food when you're fatigued. So we know fatigue is very common with heart failure, and it can be difficult for people who are feeling unwell to actually eat a nutritious diet. And so to sit down and to cut and prepare your ingredients in a seated position is one way to conserve your energy. It's also important that if you're going to do any kind of bulk cooking, that you do so on a day that you're not also trying to do other things that zap your energy. So for example, you wouldn't want to clean your house the same day that you dedicate to your food prep. Making larger quantities and freezing meals for future use is recommended. It can take that daily activity away from you and give you time to devote to other things. And I would recommend offloading some of the work. So if you would like, you could always look into grocery store to home delivery. And sometimes it's just nice to have food delivered. So Meals on Wheels, they actually do have lower sodium options that you could look at. It's really important too to plan ahead and to treat yourself. So we know birthdays, anniversary, holiday meals happen, and it's something to celebrate. But it's also important that if you're going to be attending a party and you know the food is not necessarily going to be low sodium, that you plan ahead and plan to eat lower sodium foods earlier in the day or for the remaining meal in your day. So you can see here, this is actually my sister-in-law who prepared quite a nice spread for my brother's 40th birthday. And there's all kinds of meat and cheeses. I think there was bacon in the mushroom caps with cheese. So definitely not a party that was heart-friendly by any means, but that is a reality when you're going and celebrating with family members, and so just kind of plan for these things. Another recommendation would be to avoid a food crisis. So plan appropriate snacks ahead and bring suitable food with you in your car or purse so you don't end up choosing something on the go that has higher sodium. For your favorite foods that are higher in sodium, you can reduce your serving size to fit into your sodium restriction and have less often. And again, say French fries, it's your birthday, it's what you want. Look at the nutritional value of that, and then just try to eat clean the rest of the day and not do that too often. Really important not to beat yourself up. If you have a bad day, it's only a bad day. Don't allow yourself to spiral and then comfort yourself with food and, continue with that habit just because you've had a bad day. We're not striving for perfection, and it's just important to allow yourself to have those human moments where, we don't always follow the rules to the best of our ability. And just remember that we're looking at this as a lifestyle change, not a day-to-day thing where you need to get caught up if you have a bad day. And again, just knowing your relationship with food, whether or not that is a trigger for you, stress is a trigger and you emotionally eat, looking at other ways to help manage your stress, or also using you know, choosing that food is no longer part of your entertainment. So in terms of community resources, there is an Alberta Healthy Living program where you can request support from a dietitian, so you can check out their website. The Heart and Stroke Foundation has lots of information on heart failure itself, self-care, and it also can include recipe ideas. Our website through Alberta Health Services has a wonderful directory of dietary information that was created by dietitians. So what you need to do is go to the AHS website and then search nutrition education materials. I actually will have a slide coming up that shows some of what is available. There is a Canadian chef named Ricardo who has a section emphasizing healthy meal ideas if you'd like to check him out on his website. And then finally, South Health Campus Wellness Center. Our content is currently online. However, when COVID passes, they do have in-person cooking courses that have a hands-on component, which are taught by registered dietitians. So that's a really excellent resource. So here's your Alberta Health Services site. So you can see under the Heart Health tab, there are all kinds of different information topics that you can access and print off handouts. And so if you recall, some of the information that I've actually shown in this presentation today is available under the Mediterranean style of eating. So if you'd like to go and click on that, you would be able to print that out so that you can bring it to the grocery store and start doing some planning. They also have some really great information on omega-3 fats for heart health, restricting fluid. So that is available to you. You can see they also have a direct link to resources for reducing your sodium. So recommendations for cooking without salt. And I like to point out too, it's really nice that they actually have some specific to other cultures here. So simplified Chinese, traditional Chinese, Punjabi. So it's in those languages. Here's the ricardocuisine.com. So you can see here an ingredient list for chicken and mango couscous salad. What I like about it is if you click on the nutritional facts, it will pop up like this, and then you can actually look at the milligrams of salt. The one thing that I initially was confused by was that it says for 1 serving, and so what you need to do is then looking over here, when you follow the recipe, it's actually for 4 servings. So if you divide your food into 4 equal portions, then that will give you the amount of sodium that you'll be eating. And then here is just a screenshot of what is available at the South Health Campus Wellness for online programming. And you can see that there is the Heart Healthy Eating that's available. So if you're looking for a more in-depth discussion of what that looks like, you can actually register online for more information. And the wellness is not specific only to heart healthy eating. You can see too, Food and Mood COVID-19 edition. It's a really timely addition to their programming that you may want to take a look at. So stay well and stay safe, be well, and thank you so much for joining me today.
Awesome. Thank you, Shannon. We'll be moving right away to the second presentation, and then you'll be able to ask the question. So the second presentation is by Dr. Robert Miller. He's an early career clinician researcher in the Department of Cardiac Sciences in the Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary. He has completed training in general cardiology at the University of Calgary, advanced heart failure and cardiac transplantation at Stanford University, and advanced cardiac imaging at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. He combines his clinical work in advanced heart failure with expertise in advanced cardiac imaging. His research interests include advanced cardiac imaging application in patients with cardiomyopathy, as well as epidemiology in heart failure and cardiac transplantation. So on this note, welcome, Dr. Miller. Please go ahead and share your screen.
So thanks for the introduction. Janelle did a fantastic job of talking about specific recommendations. So what I'm going to try to do is convince you that this is something you want to do and is valuable to you. So I'm mostly going to be talking about the evidence that supports all the things that we're saying. So in terms of disclosures, I'm going to say that I'm a site investigator on a trial for dietary fiber supplements that I'll talk about at the end. I don't receive any financial support for this, but it's an interest of mine. So what are the big components that we talk about in heart function clinic? We talk about salt restriction, we talk about fluid restriction, and then occasionally we talk about specific diets, but it's less common. But these are the things I'm going to talk about today. So sodium restrictions guidelines vary between country. Some countries recommend as low as less than 1,500, and some are a bit more permissive and say less than 2,500. The important thing to know is that the average daily intake around the globe is about 4 grams of salt, or 4,000 milligrams. But it does vary significantly by the cooking and social factors. So it's as high as 5,500 milligrams per day in Central Asia and as low as 2,500 milligrams per day in Sub-Saharan Africa. So there's great variation in usual salt intake. And in Canada, it's about 4,000 milligrams per day. We're pretty close to the global average. So the best evidence for cardiac impact of salt restriction comes from hypertension data. So this is a meta-analysis of many different trials that includes many thousands of patients with hypertension that were randomized either to salt restriction or no salt restriction. So the overall effect size of salt restriction is it drops your blood pressure by about 6 millimeters of mercury. So what is important to take away from that is in heart failure, salt really affects your blood volume because the impact of salt restriction on blood pressure and hypertension all relates to blood volume. So just like Chanel said, we see people in the emergency department all the time because of salt indiscretion. This shows you that if you take large groups of people, you can demonstrate huge impacts on blood pressure just by restricting their salt. And all of that impact on blood pressure is driven by blood volume. And in heart failure, that's the blood volume that brings you into the emergency departments with shortness. The impact is in patients with hypertension and without hypertension. It's really a global impact on blood pressure and blood volume. So what about more specifically in patients with heart failure? So this is an area that there's emerging evidence, and the sodium HF trial is going to report soon, but this is pilot study data. So they took 38 patients with heart failure. They were randomized to 2 different diets. One they said was low sodium, but it was 1,500 milligrams per day or less. And the other they called moderate sodium at 2,300 milligrams. So really, these are 2 different brands of low sodium diets. One is more restrictive than the other. They're both almost half of what the average Canadian eats in salt, because again, that's about 4,000 milligrams per day. So this is really a trial of 2 different brands of low sodium diet. They took patients with both heart failure with reduced ejection fraction and heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. So it really applies to everybody with heart failure. So what did they show? So they looked at change in BNP. So BNP is a blood marker of how bad your heart failure is. The higher your BNP, the more fluid you have in your body, the worse your heart failure. So the patients that were in the more restrictive diet, so that's less than 1,500 milligrams, had a lower BNP after 6 months of following a low salt diet. But what's more important, because most patients don't care what their blood work shows, is how they felt. So they also looked at something called the Kansas City Cardiomyopathy Questionnaire. So that's a questionnaire that gets a sense of how good you feel. So the higher your score, the better you feel. The patients that were in the more restrictive salt diet, so again, less than 1,500 milligrams, felt better at 6 months. So although we talk about keeping you out of the emergency room, less swelling, less shortness of breath. This is a group of patients that were randomized to a diet and felt better at 6 months. So that's really sodium. That's probably the best evidence we have for something that we can do in heart failure that's a diet-related intervention. What about fluid restrictions? The recommendations again vary. They range from less than a liter to less than 2 liters per day. It's often based on the clinical scenario. And honestly, I frequently tell some of my patients they don't need to worry about fluid restrictions, because the patients that we really target fluid restrictions for are patients that have a low serum sodium. So that's off your blood work. If your sodium level is low in your blood, it means that your body has too much water and it's diluting. Or if you're actively volume overloaded. So if you have a lot of swelling, it's difficult to get rid of. Those are patients that might benefit from fluid restriction. The last group is the patients that we really just can't keep out of hospital despite trying everything. We occasionally restrict their fluid intake just to try to keep their volume under better control. But the typical patient that has normal serum sodium, normal blood work, is doing okay on low-dose diuretics, might not need fluid restrictions. So this is something that you have to ask your physician specifically, should you be restricting? All heart failure docs have a different approach to when they start fluid restricting. So the best advice is ask your cardiologist what you should do. So where's the evidence for this fluid restriction? So this was a study that looked at fluid restriction versus just standard care, which would be drink to your thirst is the usual recommendation. So they screened almost 2,300 patients admitted with heart failure and tried to find the ones who were really in heart failure and the ones who had a low serum sodium. Out of 2,300 patients, they found 46 who met those criteria and were willing to be included in the trial. So what they did was they looked at fluid restriction in hospital and then also told them to continue with fluid restrictions outside of hospital. And again, here they're looking at quality of life. So it's a similar questionnaire to the Kansas City cardiomyopathy questionnaire that I was telling you about. So the higher your score, the better you feel. The patients who continued with the fluid restriction for 60 days after discharge felt better at 60 days than the patients who just drank to their thirst. And that's probably because these are the select patients that really have difficult to control volume and low serum sodium. So if your cardiologist tells you that yes, you should be restricting your fluid, it might not need to be less than a liter, they'll tell you specific recommendations. But if you look in the patients who we think benefit, they really do feel better at 60 days if this is something that they follow. How about specific diets? I'm not going to spend too much time on this just because I want to make sure we have enough time for questions. So the DASH diet was a diet that was designed to help stop heart failure, or sorry, hypertension. So the basis of this diet is that you eat whole grains instead of refined grains. You eat more fruits and vegetables, and you eat less red meat and less saturated fat. So if you apply this diet to populations, again, you tend to decrease blood pressure because it's getting rid of foods that have a lot of salt in them, like a lot of processed foods are going to be higher in salt intake. But how does it apply to heart failure? So this study looked at almost 39,000 Swedish men between age 45 and 79. They followed them for 18 years. And every year they did a diet log, and somebody went through all of these logs and decided how well they followed the DASH diet. So the patients who followed the diet the least were given the label of the worst diet, and the patients who followed the diet the best were labeled the best diet. And they just looked at what is the likelihood that you develop heart failure during these 18 years based on your diet. So the patients who followed the DASH diet most closely, so again, that would be eating whole grains, lots of fruits and vegetables, not eating a lot of red meat, were less likely to develop heart failure. So 22% less likely. Mediterranean diet. This is one that actually has some of the best cardiovascular data. There have been several trials. The largest trial was almost 7,800 patients who were randomized to Mediterranean diet versus usual dietary advice. So again, the basis for the Mediterranean diet is lots of fruits and vegetables, replacing red meat with fish and white meat. And then either including olive oil or tree nuts. But the basis of that is that you're trying to get healthy fats into your diet, and especially omega-3 fatty acids into your diet. So this trial splits the population in half. So half got usual dietary advice, half got the Mediterranean diet. And of the Mediterranean diet, one group got olive oil, which was actually quite a lot for most people. So it was 1 liter per week for a household, or tree nuts. The group that got usual dietary advice got some sort of financial compensation that was equivalent to the cost of olive oil or tree nuts to try to balance things out. They followed them for almost 5 years, and patients in the Mediterranean diet were 30% less likely to have a heart attack, stroke, or die. So again, huge population followed for 5 years. You were less likely to die if you ate the Mediterranean diet compared to usual dietary advice. So again, taking you back, what about in heart failure? So this is a great trial because it's unusual to see a trial only in women, but it's important. So this was 3,200 women with heart failure who were followed for 5 years. They did the same thing to the previous Swedish study that I told you about. So they looked at their diet logs and they assigned them a score based on how closely they followed Mediterranean diet or DASH diet. And in this study, if you followed the Mediterranean diet or the DASH diet, you were about 25% less likely to die compared to patients who did not follow it. So all these studies have inherent bias because patients that have healthier diet tend to make other healthy choices like not smoking, drinking less, taking multivitamins, but 25% less likely to die is hard to ignore. So the last one I want to touch on quickly was the plant-based diet. So this is any version of vegetarian or vegan diet that you might hear about. There are lots of different classifications of plant-based diets. Some are more restrictive, some identify healthy whole grains versus unhealthy plant foods. But again, in a large group of patients, if you assign them how closely they follow a plant-based diet, patients who eat more closely along a plant-based diet were less likely to die during follow-up. So the underlying link between those 3 diets is that we're trying to tell people to eat more fruits and vegetables in their diet, replacing processed, refined starches and grains with fruits and vegetables. So why would that make a difference? So dietary fiber can alter the gut microbiome, which can lead to changes in markers of heart failure. And the way it does that is it increases a proportion of healthy gut bacteria. So if you look in a mouse model of hypertension and assign them either to control, which just means they eat a usual mouse diet, or if you feed them a high fiber diet or a diet that's high in acetate, which is a byproduct of healthy gut bacteria, what you see is that the mice that are fed a high fiber diet have lower blood pressure. But more importantly, and something you can only do in animal studies, is they looked at how much scar there was in the heart. So the mice that ate the typical hypertension diet developed scar quite quickly. And the mice that were fed the high fiber or the acetate diet really didn't develop much scar in their hearts at all. So it seemed to be protective in terms of how much scar forms in the heart. There's also several studies that have looked at gut microbiome and can you change it with different changes in diet? And the answer is yes. Diets that are high in fruits and vegetables tend to be higher in bacteria that we think are good for you. It changes as quickly as within 24 hours, but it really takes more than 10 days to see long-term differences. So if you're gonna make a change to your diet, don't expect everything to change overnight. It's gonna take weeks before you notice a difference, which was why all those studies looked at 60 days or 6 months. So these are things you have to decide and change your habits more than just going on a crash diet and trying to improve how you feel. So what are we doing in Calgary? We have a study that's called the EAST-HF. And this is a study that's looking at dietary fiber supplements in patients with heart failure. So we're trying to do the same thing as that mouse model. We're seeing how people do with more dietary fiber in their diets, and whether or not that changes A, how you feel, because that's the most important thing, and B, does it really change what we see in terms of gut bacteria? So anybody with heart failure is a candidate. The major contraindication is people that can't control their diets, like they're getting all their meals pre-made or delivered to them, or patients who require a special diet that they're not allowed to change. And we're randomizing people to 2 types of dietary fiber, or something that looks like dietary fiber but really is nothing. The study's relatively short, it's just 12 weeks. We think this is going to help people feel better and lead to longer, larger trials of dietary fiber. If you have any questions, feel free to contact any of the people that are listed here. We're happy to tell you more about the trial. And also happy to give you more information about dietary fiber in general. Enter time. Hopefully we finish in time to let people ask questions. You just have to unmute yourself.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
You can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
I did notice that you didn't mention